Welcome to another Spaces podcast. I'm Alex G. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Mark Poppy, the Property Training Manager for the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy. With experience in both the public and private sectors, Mark has extensive experience in local government, from managing frontline services and rising through the ranks to be a strategic director, leading on a range of innovative projects. Throughout his career, Mark has specialised in delivering efficiency through transformation, and he has been the lead for a national efficiency programme focusing on new and alternative models of public sector delivery. He has a track record of developing new partnerships, introducing modular housing, and ensuring that property portfolios support organisational strategic direction. He describes his approach to projects as being commercially minded and community orientated. He holds an MBA from the University of Hertfordshire and is a graduate of the Ashridge Business School's Advanced Leadership Programme. He was awarded a bursary from the Society of Local Authority Chief Executives for an innovative paper on partnering within the private sector, which involved a visit to the US, of which I'm sure he offset his emissions. His interest in net zero arises from his experience as a self-builder and his work at CIPFA, developing the content for the Diploma in Strategic Asset Management in the public sector. Mark, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Alex. Thanks for inviting me.
Excellent. Thanks. So Mark, really interested in your sort of self-build and the modular housing elements, and with our sort of theme of net zero and sustainability. Do you want to just talk us a little bit through how your personal journey to sustainability began?
Yeah, I mean, that's a sort of big question, and could probably take the whole session, but I'll try and be brief. I think there's probably three elements to it. I mean, I think everyone from just sort of, life, you can sort of pick, from what you read, what you see, what you've sort of speaking to other people, that the whole sort of, this whole sort of topic is becoming more and more important. I've got two sort of early 20-something kids, so they'll probably not be big kids now. And I guess it's been something that's probably been around for most of their lives. And just from talking to them and their friends, it's such a high profile issue. And, and they get their sort of news and information, not from probably the traditional sources that we do, like, the broadsheets and news at 10 or news at 9, that they get a host of information, and their sort of interest in it has sort of helped me learn. I guess you can learn a lot from youngsters. And lastly, as you mentioned, in 2019, took a year out to sort of project manage a self-build. We were very fortunate to sort of get through the hurdle of planning to start with, and because it was in a conservation area and in the green belt. But so we were fortunate to get permission, and that whole journey from going to exhibitions, subscribing to Self Build magazine, writing contracts for the sort of various elements of the build, the whole sort of question of insulation, solar heating, etc., I guess was a sort of a very practical insight to it from two perspectives. One is what you can do to be sustainable, but obviously working within a sort of financial envelope as well. So that it was a combination of sort of decisions which were good for the environment and which your kids was to support, but also ones which were sort of financially driven as well. So it's a combination of just being out and about. You can see the changes in climate and the world. Talking to perhaps younger people, and the practical experience of doing the self-build is where my sort of journey started.
Okay, thanks. That's really interesting. And I guess there's an interesting sort of juxtaposition between one.
I think how you have to look at both sort of sides of the equation at the same time. So it's not just a question of, okay, let's tackle the sort of sustainable and green issues, and let's tackle the budget issues. I think it is a whole holistic approach, as you mentioned. And I think, as you touched on in my introduction, I work for a property company which is owned by a private equity company. And, and private equity company, you probably can't get more commercial than they are when making decisions. But they, even 3 or 4 years ago, saw the sort of commercial benefits of the whole sustainable and green agenda, and the link to the modular housing product that you mentioned. So I think in the longer term, there will be financial benefits from being sustainable and following the green agenda. I mean, for the early adopters and the first innovators, that might be more difficult to sort of demonstrate and prove that. But I think in the longer term, it will become a much more commonplace and also much more commercial. I mean, one of the reasons in our self-build that we took some of the initiatives is because as and when we come to sell it, they will be assets or initiatives that will promote it from the marketing point of view. So the fact is, particularly, in the current time with the energy crisis, if you can sort of demonstrate that you've got a house which is excellently rated, A-rated, the fact is that the cost of running it is only whatever it is, then that's going to put you in a good advantage in the housing market to sell it in the future. And likewise, a portfolio of local authority assets is going to be in a much better position than ones that sort of obviously need lots of investments. So it's about balancing the argument between the green argument and also the financial argument. But in some ways, they're not arguments. I think they're just different sort of sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's sort of the middle of the Venn diagram, isn't there, where it all comes together, and I suppose that's probably fundamentally the area that most of our audience are sort of interested in, because that's probably where they see themselves. But we'll come to that a bit more, I'm sure, in a few moments. I think clearly for all of us, net zero remains an ambitious target. We're trying to achieve it by 2030. Some local authorities have pushed that back in declaring their climate emergencies to 2035 or 2040. But regardless, net zero in its own right still remains an ambitious target. So if you were to boil it down into simple steps, what advice would you give?
I think there's probably two steps, and it's similar to sort of what we're just talking about. I think you've got to win sort of hearts and minds in terms of the whole agenda, and how you do that. The hearts aspect is around the long-term benefit. It's around sort of the cultural sort of benefits. It's around the benefits for society as a whole, and not just the current generation, but future generations as well. So there's a whole sort of emotive argument, I guess, or a case to be put forward. But I guess we coming from a CIPFA perspective, with the sort of more the sort of financial side, then you've got to win sort of people's minds as well. And I think that's therefore proving any sort of investments or policy through the sort of business case as well. So you're right about the sort of authorities putting a climate emergency, but in some ways it was just almost like a policy decision. I don't think many have actually sort of put in place the sort of key performance indicators of how they're going to actually sort of measure that, where the finance is going to come to actually deliver it. And so therefore I think that it is a very strong emotive argument, but which pulls at the heartstrings. But I think there has to be a much stronger financial argument as well, to actually sort of to prove to the broader authority as a whole, to get in the local authority situation, to get the Section 151 officer on board, or the portfolio holder for good and well-being as well.
And I think the money point is probably the sticking factor, isn't it, in most local authorities that I've worked with, which is very much around, I guess there's two parts to this, one of which is that traditionally the environmental strategy has sat as a competing strategy with other local authority strategies. So it sits there competing with your children's strategy and your education strategy and your housing strategy, etc. So it hasn't had its own remit at the heart of the organisation. So I wonder whether there is certainly an argument for placing the environmental strategy right in the centre, so every business case needs to conform to it at some point. But I think fundamentally, and I wonder from a CIPFA perspective, with that lens, whether or not there needs to be some innovation around the traditional uses of public sector finance. So, for example, if you've always done what you always do with your kind of capital and revenue, you're always going to get what you've always got, which is, yes, you can invest in some things, but you can't afford to maintain them. And I suppose a number of local authorities over the last sort of 10, 15 years have probably, not by neglect, but just by shortage of capital, or shortage of revenue, I should say, have seen disinvestment in their property assets. And now when it comes to getting a fabric first approach, for example, to the portfolio, actually that investment piece right at the outset is huge, because they haven't had the revenue funds to maintain the properties as you would have liked previously. And I wonder whether, with your CIPFA lens, whether or not there's something innovative perhaps that can be lobbied to consider that traditional use of funds.
Well, I think back to sort of earlier part of your question about sort of the environmental sort of strategy being the key to a certain extent. I think that it has to sort of be a very strong part of the overall corporate plan. All authorities have their sort of corporate plan, which is then mirrored in, as you say, the children's one or housing one, etc. So I think it's very much to ensure that the environmental one is linked to that. You mentioned earlier that CIPFA run a diploma in asset management, and talking to some of the delegates on that, often the sort of corporate plan is written in isolation from the people with responsibility for the buildings and assets, and it's very much to sort of try and join that up. So it's great having a climate emergency declaration, but if there no discussion has been taken with the people actually looking after the buildings, then there's going to be a discourse and a problem going forward. So I think first of all that the whole agenda needs to sort of play into what the corporate plan is for the authority. On to your second point regarding sort of funding, I think funding is always going to be a challenge, and always has been a challenge. If you go back to sort of the 90s and 80s of best value and competitive tendering before that, sort of finding funding for delivery of services and improvements to buildings, it has always been difficult. I think one of the things a lesson that I've picked up through CIPFA on the property work is it's probably having projects that are ready and deliverable, as opposed to sometimes just following the money, because sometimes they sort of a bit of money is found down the back of the sofa of the Section 151 officers. Can we get this spent by the end of March? And it's the problem is then is sort of pulling almost a rabbit out of the hat with a project. And I think to a certain extent there has to be sort of projects that are sort of without using the ex-Prime Minister's term, but oven ready to a certain extent. The fact is that if you can have projects that are either ready to be funded through the authorities' programme, or more importantly, be ready when there is sort of central government funding around. The way it seems to be this sort of mad dash. There's a release 4 of a particular sort of funding stream, and then there's a sort of mad dash to sort of pull a sort of green finance initiative agenda, which seems to be quite successful in some authorities, whereby they're getting the sort of community to be involved in some of this sort of some of these projects as well. And I guess the issue there is obviously the sort of the governance and the robustness and the sort of the ethical decisions that surround that, and ensuring again that probably there's a strong business case for and strong governance arrangements around it. Because I think there's been 1 or 2 cases that very successful projects have come forward. I think Wokingham being one of the places. But again, it's about trying these different sort of innovative approaches. And a difficult thing for local authorities is often being first. You're quite happy to sort of follow when it's been proved successful elsewhere, but it's about sort of often being first to do something, particularly when looking at new ways of financing things.
Yeah, absolutely, and being a pioneer is probably quite a lonely place sometimes, because
yes.
you're learning the mistakes as you go.
Unfortunately, local authorities, it's about it's about almost the fear of getting it wrong rather than the joy of getting it right.
Absolutely, but there are a number of local authorities that are grasping this and are finding ways in which they've planned ahead, actually, as you've just outlined, to have these projects sort of ready. So when finance does become available, or an influx of cash suddenly appears from somewhere, that they are good to go, and that they can test the market and see the benefit. And I suppose there is that sort of ongoing financial argument that can we project, certainly with the new technologies, 20 years down the line, to generate a payback? Have we actually seen real examples where those are playing out, so you can start to build your business case, and your business case can be rooted in fact rather than in assumption? And yes. I suppose that's something we've all yet to learn.
And I also think that, interesting, I think at the Labour Party conference yesterday, sort of announced sort of £8 billion of potential funding for sort of green sort of technology. Interesting to see this, the new sort of Conservative leadership, how they react to that when their conferences come. So there could be still new funding coming down the track, whichever party is in power in the longer term. And again, I think that, so therefore having these projects ready to go is going to become more and more important.
Absolutely, and I think the more the more the agenda switches into that political scene, hopefully we'll see some real tangible benefits from it, or certainly some tangible outputs from it. I think one of the other things that comes into play, which I'd be interested in your take, especially you sort of alluded to this when you were talking about your self-build, is that you can invest your money in innovative green schemes for the built environment, but planning in its own right hasn't changed significantly to force people down a particular route. So why would you go to the expense of air source heating, for example, when planning still allows your sort of fossil fuel kind of gas boilers to be up and running? They're cheaper to implement. So actually, do we need to consider in the planning system something that trajects people down a particular path?
Well, I should declare an interest there because my wife's a planner, so I'd have to sort of plead the Fifth Amendment.
I'm afraid I won't let you off that easily.
But no, I think so. Therefore, I suppose as a regular reader of Planning Weekly, I'll stick up for them. To a certain extent, I think they are prepared to look at the sort of the innovation, the new ideas. It's often the sort of the policy in the planning inspectorate. So I think that the planners do want to be innovative. It's just within the sort of rules that they have to work within. I guess sticking up for them, like a lot of people in the built environment, there is there's a big shortage of planners as well.
Yeah, very true. And again, I suppose this is all part of the trajectory that we're headed for. And I suppose coupled with that, then I'd sort of put it to you to say, with regards to the net zero effect, actually is the net aspect a bit of an easy way out? Should we actually be striving for carbon zero within the built environment, and actually is that remotely achievable, do you think, in the next generation?
I think you've got to start somewhere, and I think it's almost best to start with a goal which is reasonably achievable. I think if you it's a bit like, if you want to, say I come from a sort of leisure background originally, so therefore if you said to someone, right, I want to run a marathon, and then you suddenly set them a target of 2.5 hours, that might be just so much it completely puts them off. But if you said, well, actually, if you could do the marathon and I think you could do it in 4 hours, then that is enough. That's a sort of enough of a target to actually push them. And once they sort of start on the training regime and they get into it, they might say, actually, I think, if I up my training from 4 to 5 days a week, I could perhaps do 3.5 hours, and we'll go for that. And I think it's just similar to with this agenda as well. If a target is almost too far in the future or too challenging, it is quite difficult to get sort of people motivated and on that journey with you. It has to be sort of almost within their grasp to do it. So I think the net zero one is the right one at the moment to actually just get the authorities and people on that agenda. Because as I mentioned right at the start, depending on your experiences and to a certain extent your age, your views on it will be very, very different. So I think the net zero one is something perhaps more people can coalesce around in trying to achieve that than something which is perhaps more and perhaps too aspirational at this stage.
Okay, so effectively, if you to a large extent sort of bite off what you can see in front of you and you're making steps in the right direction, then the road ahead will become clearer. Is that the sort of philosophy? I
think so. And then you obviously start to sort of stretch yourself as you started on that journey. I just think if it's too ambitious to start with, it will put a lot of organisations off doing that. They think they won't have the capacity, they don't think they have the resources to do it. Whereas I think, you know, if they think that it's doable, then they'll make a start. And, you know, is the old sort of saying, the first step is always the hardest, and I think, you know, that applies very much to this as well.
Yeah, so true. So just I think finally from me, Mark, is there sort of one kind of must-read book or article or piece of media that you would recommend to our members that significantly shape your views around this subject?
There's probably two or three. One would be which your members wouldn't want to do, is subscribe to Self Build magazine for a while.
Or Planning Weekly. You're going to say Planning Weekly next.
Yes, I used to get that for free. I get that for free from my wife anyway, but I did have to subscribe to that. I think there's probably two. I mean, it's worth having a look at the CIPFA Guide to Asset Management, because we sort of, as part with a bit of a plug for the course, that we sort of one of the modules is very much around the sort of new and emerging strategic issues, and obviously the whole sort of net zero is very much part of that. And look at that course is aimed at people in the property world. And the other one is there's one called, which I've actually got out, called The Last Lecture, and it's about a guy who's unfortunately a lecturer, who's unfortunately sort of dying of cancer, and it's a lecture to his sons that are growing up, and that very much sort of touches on this many things, that the messages he wants to leave to his two boys that are growing up, but one of them is very much about protecting the planet. So that, you know, back to my original thing, it's very much more of an emotive argument for it, but I think, you know, that was something which really got me thinking. And then probably, as I said, on a practical perspective, doing the actual self build as well. So it's called The Last Lecture, and it's by a guy called Randy Pash.
That's great. Mark, thank you so much for that, and thank you for joining us today, sharing your thoughts with us and our